Why play ambushers? Well, you might have a strong melee item opener and want to play around a melee carry unit. You have a good spot for reroll and think that you can hit many of the reroll units in the ambusher line. Or you're very comfortable flexing within a line. Ambushers is very fun because there's many different carries at different costs, so depending on what you hit, you can try and find a way to play around whichever units you have the most of and itemize towards those units. However, it's very hard to reach max cap. A lot of times you're trying to itemize as well as reroll for low cost units and then also hit high cost units in order to properly cap out, which makes it a little bit awkward at certain times. Additionally, it lacks stability before hitting. Sometimes, especially when you're playing melee units, if they are not upgraded, they often die before being able to do a large portion of your damage because they do not have the security of being behind a strong front line. Additionally, it requires lots of gold / high rolling. This relates itself to the idea of how you reach your max cap with the comp. You often have to hit 5 ambusher, which requires a jinx, so you either have to be high rolling to find a jinx early, high rolling that you hit all of your units early, or just be in such a spot where there's enough resources for you to be able to do both. And often, if contested, it's extremely hard to win out. Often, even if somebody is playing like within the line, but other units in the line, like other scrap players in the lobby that are holding on to echoes, or other rebel players that are holding on to jinxes, it becomes an extremely hard win out because you won't have the resources to hit those high cost units that you need in order to cap out your board. So, if you like my content, please make sure to like and subscribe. Also turn on notifications if that's something that you would like to do. This is my daily TFT gaming content that I do, so I do guides or VOD reviews and stuff like that every single day. So if I've helped you and you're a returning viewer, please make sure to hit the subscribe button. So what are ambushers? Let's go through the trait. So ambushers, basically the way that it works is that ambushers is like the crit chance kind of build that you go for. Basically, all of ambushers abilities can critically strike, and then they also gain bonus critical strike chance and critical strike damage. So critical strike chance is the likelihood of an attack being a crit. Making the abilities crit means that when they cast their ability, it can basically be a critical hit. And then critical strike damage is when you have a crit, that's what scales your crit damage basically. So what's really nice about ambushers as well is that you gain so much critical strike chance that eventually if you have full critical strike chance, or if your ability is already crit and you put crit items on these units, eventually once you have a large amount of critical strike chance, it starts to spill over to be additional critical strike damage, which is something that can really make this board cap out its damage very high. So when we talk about when to play these boards, typically you want to play it when you have melee items. All of the carries, except for Jinx, are going to be primary melee carry units. So you want to have frontline melee items like Omnivamp. You want to have damage frontline, and you want to have stuff that gives them survivability like Edge of Night, Titans, Asterix. These are all good options for different versions of the units. Echo is AP, but most of the other units are AD, so typically an AD opener is kind of nice, but you can also play around Echo and play around AP items as well. Additionally, the other condition is usually like either an ambusher crest, or there's a specific ambusher augment called Loot Explosion, where it gives you cash out similar to something like Spoils of War, but a little bit better, that scales and works with the ambushers critically striking to give you more loot. So Loot Explosion used to be a very reliable thing that you would just click and instantly play around Camille when Camille was very broken. Now Camille is starting to get a little bit more popular, but the ambusher line kind of is reworked to be more dependent as a sum of its parts. So Loot Explosion is quite nice, but I wouldn't say it's a forcing augment. It's more like if I have a good spot for it and then I see Loot Explosion, then it would be a really good spot. So before we go any further, let's just talk about some late game boards as well as like the scrap board in general. So when you're playing around Ambusher, the trait maxes out at 5 Ambusher, and there are 5 Ambusher units. So there is Powder, which sometimes people play these experimental frontline Powder builds with Ambusher lines. I don't necessarily believe in it, so we're not going to be talking about that too much because I just think that it's mostly bait, or like you have to high roll very hard. Typically what you're itemizing towards is Camille, Smeech, or Echo. Jinx you can also itemize towards, but you can't really plan around Jinx very easily because typically you're going to be trying to play around Camille or Smeech. The reroll variations of the Ambusher line are quite popular, and if you're not rerolling, typically it's like a fast 9 very tempo comp where you play around Echo and Jinx, which we'll talk about. When you look at the units, Camille, she does adaptive damage, which is really interesting. So basically, she will scale off her AD, but she will do either AP or AD damage based on whichever unit she's attacking, whichever one has like whichever one would do more, she'll does more damage. So Camille's very consistent, especially early game, at just dealing a massive amount of damage. So Camille is one option that you can reroll. You can also reroll Smeech. Often when you're rerolling, you try and reroll both Camille and Smeech, but then that requires a little bit of high roll because one's a 2 cost, one's a 3 cost, so your rolls become a little bit awkward on whether you roll on 6 or whether you roll on 7. But Smeech, basically, he targets the enemy with the fewest items within 4 hexes, and then after killing, he leaps again and does extra damage, or sorry, dealing a little bit less damage, but he basically leaps to new targets. So Smeech has this resetting ability where if he kills the unit that he's targeting, he'll just reset onto a new unit. So Smeech is very good at just absolutely decimating backlines and jumping around. Especially in a backline, if they have bad positioning, sometimes the Smeech can reset onto a low-cost unit that he just easily kills, and then instantly find himself on a main carry and doing a bunch of damage towards the backline. Echo's a similar way. Echo is Firelight Scrap Ambusher. Echo does AP damage and recently got buffed, which is why a lot of more people are playing Ambushers. Basically, the whole line, both, I think Camille got buffs, Smeech got buffs, as well as Echo got buffs, so the whole line together is just a much better line to play nowadays. Echo has a similar effect to Smeech. When you're playing around Ambushers, Echo can do massive amounts of damage. Even before Echo got buffed, Ambusher Echo always did a lot of damage. It was just kind of awkward because the rest of the board was kind of like weird. It's really a sum of its parts, if anything. But Echo, with Firelight, can easily just find himself in these awkward spots in the back line and just absolutely decimate, because he has a little bit like an AoE effect where he hits like adjacent enemies or nearby targets, so you can just explode damage right in like the sore parts of your enemy's boards and just absolutely decimate and win a game really easily. This comp relies a lot on just getting these like cheeky kills that bypass the front line, so playing around Smeech and Echo is typically the preferred itemizations, but you can also play around Camille in a lot of cases. When you're thinking about the max cap or quote-unquote big board that you make, a lot of times you reach a board that looks something like this. You're basically always going to want to play 5 Ambusher. When you're playing this comp, I cannot stress enough, this is the part where it becomes very high roll. This comp relies on 5 Ambusher. Now you might think to yourself, well, why does it rely on 5 Ambusher? 5 Ambusher just gives you more crit. If my ability is already critting, I already have a bunch of crit damage, why do I need 5 Ambusher? And it's because of the second part. I don't think I said it before by accident, that's my poor reading skills. But if you read 5 Ambusher, it's 55% critical strike chance, 25% critical strike damage, that's fine. Also gain 15% durability. I cannot stress enough, when you are playing a bunch of frontline melee units and you just give them tanky stats, that's the part where you turn it into a demon-like win-out comp. If you play this Ambusher line and you don't have a Jinx, for example, and you don't ever hit 5 Ambusher, that's where it feels like it just falls like a rock in a pond. It just boom, it just goes straight, you just sink and you just lose a lot of placements. You can still get a top 4, but 5 Ambusher is such a massive spike, and that's what makes this comp a little bit awkward a lot of the time, because hitting 5 Ambusher requires you to hit a Jinx, but then if you're re-rolling Camille and Smeech, it's like you're just kind of hoping that you come across the Jinx as you're re-rolling. You can't really tempo around it. So now some people say, okay, well then I'll just tempo around it, I'll play around Echo, and then I'm rolling on level 8, and then after level 8 I can go to level 9, but then you lack the stability because Echo is basically trying to do everything for your board, because until you have a Jinx, if you're solo carry Echo and these guys aren't 3-starred, you run into some awkward spots. That's what I mean by you have to have a good spot for the comp where you feel like you're kind of high rolling. I wouldn't really play this unless I have a lot of copies of either Camille or Smeech, and then you can dual carry those with an Echo. You really want to hit a Smeech or a Camille early so that you can push levels in order to hit the max cap, because the 5 Ambusher is just so important, and I cannot stress it enough. But anyways, when you're playing your board, you're very flexible with the extra units you can play. But typically, because you need to have Firelight for Echo, a lot of times you're almost always going to be playing around a Scar. You can also go for Scar 3 if it's like one of those really high econ portals, or if you have something like, what's the augment? Prismatic Ticket, where you can hit like a Scar 3, but typically you're going to be going for just a little bit of a Watcher frontline to increase your tankiness. You can also play around some extra Sentinel units just to give you, once again, some more tankiness, armor and MR to your whole board. So typically you'll see like a Rumble and a Loris and play around it. Additionally, Powder, a lot of times you just put in the front line because she has Scrap Shield, so you just hope that she gets like one cast off and that's about it. You're not really going to be itemizing or playing around Powder in most cases, and she's going to be the first unit that you drop if you hit an Ambusher Emblem. Ambusher Emblem is really nice because you can just get a lot of damage on a lot of units. If you just find any sort of 5-cost unit that you can just slot in and put an Ambusher Emblem on, now they're just going to have a lot of critical strike chance and a lot of critical strike damage. So a lot of times, like in a max cap scenario, you just put on a Rumble. But this is like a very highly optimistic board. I would stress it that a lot of times you're just rerolling level 6 or level 7, and you're not playing a lot of these high cost units, but this is just to say like, hey, this is a possible board that you can play. So when you're playing around the units, let's start with Camille. So I'm going to put everybody off to the side a little bit just on this board. I'm going to talk about itemizations. So Camille, typically what you want when you're playing all the ambushers, almost all of them, you want to make a Hand of Justice. Hand of Justice gives a little bit of critical strike chance. If you have critical strike chance that overspills, like first of all, having like 100% crit chance just makes it way more consistent on their damage, because they also have increased critical strike damage via the ambusher trait and their abilities critically strike. So you want to maybe make glove items a lot of the time. That's usually a good indicator of a nice spot for ambushers. It's not essential, but it just makes their damage more consistent. Additionally, if you ever spill into above 100% critical strike chance, then that, I think it's every 2% of critical strike chance turns to 1% of critical strike damage. I'm not 100% sure because I don't play League. I just play TFT, and I don't read enough into the numbers to know that. But the idea is that even if you stack a bunch of glove items on these units, it typically translates really well into later opportunity to do more damage with the critical strike chance to damage conversion. So a lot of times it's Hand of Justice. Depending on what you need, you can basically build Camille in many different ways. A lot of times what I like to do is just put Titans on her and just make her very tanky. So I think an older build that I used to usually go, if I had the opportunity, was something like double Titans. You can also give her survivability in the means of Edge of Night. You can also make her have like insane amounts of Omnivamp, but with Camille, she heals a lot because of her passive ability anyway. Or it's not her passive, her active. She heals for 33% of her damage. So making like double Omnivamp isn't as good on Camille. Usually I would just go for more damage, which is like, you know, along the lines of just like tankiness and damage items of the melee options. I've even seen like double Hodge sometimes, just because Hodge has good damage indicators on her. But typically you try not to roll for Camille. You roll for Camille if you have a bunch of Camilles, basically, or if you have really good items for her that you can put them on. The main carry a lot of times with this comp now is Smeech, in my opinion at least. When you're playing around Smeech, you just want him to jump around and reset a bunch. So you want to give him a lot of damage as well as a lot of survivability. So because Smeech doesn't have built-in like actual healing the same way Camille does, a lot of times I find that it's best just to put double Omnivamp on the Smeech. You just want this guy to just be unable to die. So tankiness as well as survivability is usually good, just because it allows him to reset a bunch as well as just stay alive when he's behind enemy lines, basically. So sometimes you'll have, I'm looking for Titans again. I'm really bad at finding the item sometimes. I really like Hodge, Bloodthirster, Titans. I think this is the build with Smeech that I usually find the most success with. You just get Bloodthirster shield, so you have a lot of survivability. You stack up Titans, so he gets the extra attack damage and ability power, but at the same time also gets a little bit of tankiness from the armor and MR. And then Hand of Justice, a little bit of crit strike chance, as well as a little bit of opportunity to do a bunch more damage with the extra ability power and attack damage that it gives. Additionally, you can also go for more survivability builds with him. Something like Edge of Night sometimes works out really well, because if he jumps the enemy lines and he gets overwhelmed, Edge of Night makes it so he just doesn't take too much damage, and basically some of it comes back to the front line, so this Smeech has a little bit more ability to do damage. Next is Echo. So a lot of times what I would recommend when playing this comp is that you roll on level 7 and you roll around Smeech and Echo. So it's not 100% guaranteed, but it's pretty reliable to hit 4 costs on level 7. You might not get an upgraded 4 cost on level 7, but playing around Smeech and Echo is generally the way that you cap out a lot higher. You want to roll on higher odds. If you're rolling for Camille, you usually have to roll on level 6. But if you're rolling for Smeech, you're rolling on level 7, and you have the opportunity to also hit some copies of Echo, which then allows you to itemize towards Echo. With Echo, I really like to just have the same type of builds like Hodge, and then stacking either crit items or some sort of AP items. They're also frontline units, so sometimes I also like to have Spark on Echo, just because when he jumps the back line, it helps to just like have that spark effect on all of the units that are back there. But otherwise, something like Guardbreaker, and like if you can, like a lot of times like with this comp, you're usually making like AD items that you can play around Smeech and Camille. So a lot of times you have extra rods or extra AP items. So even random stuff like a Rabadon's works out really well. If you can pair Damage Amp with the crit strike chance, then you can increase your damage like multiplicative, because you'll have like the perfect crit strike and all the crit strike damage from ambushers, as well as have, sorry, I'm still looking for this Rabadons, and then you'll still have the damage amp from your items, which then stacks with that crit chance. I am so lost. Where's Rabadons? There we go. We found it. Let's go. We found it. So something like this, just have full damage, so that when Echo dives the backline, he absolutely decimates everybody. Of course, when you're building these damage variations on these units, it is very reliant on actually hitting the 5 ambusher trait. If you do not hit 5 ambusher, then you don't get the durability, so you lose a lot of your survivability. So I cannot stress enough, a lot of times you're going to have to make stuff like Edge of Night and Titans and these more tank melee items. Even on Echo, you might be forced to put something like a Titans or something else on him, just because he'll dive the backline, he'll die instantly. So the fun part about this comp, like I've been talking a lot about it, it feels kind of high roll at times, but the fun part about it is that you have basically 3 carries, each at a different cost. So when you're playing around this comp, a lot of times you have to be a little bit adaptive yourself in terms of what you want to play. You can't just go into a game and say, I'm X unit, GG, this is the best way to play the comp. A lot of times you'll see people either roll for Camille and Smeech, or they'll go for Camille and Echo, or they'll go for Smeech and Echo, right? My personal favorite is playing Smeech Echo. I think that's the more consistent, reliable option if you have the choice. But basically, whichever unit you hit more of is the unit that you try to play around. You always want to maybe play around Echo. Like Smeech Camille doesn't cap very high. It feels like you know, more of like a play for 4th reroll style comp. So typically you want to make it to those higher levels and play around Echo, because I think Echo just does an insane amount of damage in the ambusher line comparatively to the other ones. But either way, what you want to do is pick 2 and go with the 2 of them. So if you see a bunch of Camilles, for example, then you should roll on level 6, hit your Camille 3, make sure that you're consistent, that like your board has consistent power because you're stabilized around your Camille, and then you can decide if you're going to roll on 7 odds to try and find Smeech 3, or if you're going to go 8 and try and play Echo. So what you can do is you can roll for Camille early. If you high roll into multiple copies of Camille, you just roll for Camille on 6, and then you worry about the rest of the stuff later. If you find a lot of Smeeches, then you will probably want to roll on 7 odds. Roll on 7 odds, and then depending on how your roll down goes on level 7, you're either going to play around Smeech and Camille, because you can hit 2 costs on level 7 pretty easily, or you're going to play around Echo, which you can also hit on level 7. So Smeech is the one where it's like pretty flexible in terms of what you can hit, but a lot of it is contingent on you having a lot of copies of Smeech. Additionally, if you have a lot of copies of Camille and you feel like you can greed, like you're doing really well in the lobby, then you could play around just Smeech, and you can just play around Smeech anyways, and you can just level to 7 and try and complete your Camille on level 7, because your level 7 odds give you a greater chance of hitting the upgraded units. Additionally, on level 7, there is a small percentage chance you can find a Jinx, which is really hard to, which I don't think you can do on level 6. So roll on level 7 has the benefit of you having an easier time making it to that 5 ambusher threshold by finding the Jinx. Additionally, let's say you're in a very high roll spot. Let's say you don't have either of these units like close to being 3-star, but you have a lot of tempo, right? Let's say you're very strong comparatively to the rest of the lobby. Some people, what they try and do with the ambusher comp, which works sometimes, is you just play full tempo fast 9. What's the idea behind that? Well, the idea is if you natural, like, you know, let's say you're high rolling, you're very strong, you hit like Echo 2 or something, or you hit like a very stable board relative to the rest of the lobby, then what happens is instead of just re-rolling at all, a lot of people will just push levels and cap out around a bunch of legendary units. You'll just go to level 9, try and play around a Rumble 2, a Jinx 2, for example, and just play the solo Echo carry. Additionally, if you're uncontested with this line, sometimes because you have so much vacant space on the board, you'll see people play double Echo as well, and just play like vertical firelight double Echo. This is not a comp that you can just decide to play, and this because like obviously this is a very high roll situation. You have to be able to make it to level 9 playing off of like this more niche line, but this is a possibility because of the way the firelight works and stuff like that. This is very strong. This type of variation, don't get me wrong, it is game winning. It just is not, it's not the first pick ever. This is only if you feel like you're high rolling very hard, then you can play around this. So that brings me back to this version of the comp, right? There's 2 other things to mention, but first I'll just talk about this. A lot of these extra units that I'm showing here, they are very interchangeable. right? Depending on if you're carrying Echo, you might not even need to play Firelight and Watcher. So a lot of times you can play many different variations. You can play this with Bruisers, you can play it with Sentinels. Basically beyond these 5 units, especially if you're rerolling on level 7, you basically just want to use the last 2 spots to be some sort of frontline trait that helps to stabilize your board a little bit. Often I'll end up being in a spot and I'll hit like a Lowy, and I'll play like Sentinel like this with an Alawi and a Loris. It's not super important exactly what you hit. There's also versions of this where you play Chem Baron. I'm not sure how good the Chem Baron variations are, but the idea is that you just get like the Chem Baron cash outs and then you can use it to strengthen your Smeech. Chem Baron's pretty nice to play in your mid game, because if you're really strong and you're win streaking anyways, you can play Chem Baron, and the low Chem Baron cash outs give you a duplicator. So it actually makes it easier for you to hit Smeech 3, and then you can just drop Chem Baron later. That's a really viable strat as well that you can play when you're tempoing around it. But the idea is, as long as you can hit the units, you'll be fine. The board really falls apart if you don't have a stable front line, and because your units are melee frontline units, they're majority of your front line. So you need to hit like maybe not the 3-star to be stable, but if you don't have them upgraded, they die too fast. So you want to make sure that you have these frontline upgrades so you can overwhelm your opponent. And that's what I mean by you have to have a good spot for. You can't just like decide to play Ambusher with no copies of the units. A lot of times it's high roll because you need to hit everything, and it's going to be really hard for you to get like that top 2 placement if you don't have 5 Ambusher in. You can probably get a 4th with 4 Ambusher. I'm not saying you can. You can probably get like a 3rd or even a 2nd in some lobbies with 4 Ambusher. It's just without 5 Ambusher, this comp does not have like the chutzpah to get that win out. Additionally, the other conditions for Ambushers that's really great is artifacts. This is one of the OG broken artifact comps. There are multiple artifacts that work really well with the Ambusher units, especially Camille. Camille is the main artifact goddess when you think about the Ambusher trait. Silver Dawn is broken on Camille. It's one of her best items. She's one of the best item holders for Silver Dawn. Silver Dawn just gives her a bunch of attack damage, armor, and magic resist, so she becomes a giga tank. She stuns, and she takes all that AD. She does adaptive damage, so even if they're like AD resistant, she'll just do AP damage in its place. She's crit, so she has massive crit. So you just gave her a bunch of stats and massive crit. She just one-shots everything. She just walks around, one-shots everything. If she doesn't one-shot it, she stuns it. So she 2-shots it, and they can't move. So it's broken. It's really good. It's just something that works really well on her. If you see Silver Dawn and you think or if you see Ambushers and you think you can play around Silver Dawn, you can do that as well. Additionally, you'll also have these 2 items that are crazy. Spectral Cutlass, very good on Camille. Basically, she just teleports the backline, and then she just one-shots the enemy carry. Done. She just kills them. When you have Ambushers that do this massive crit strike damage, you want to just make them just delete the enemy backline. So playing around Spectral Cutlass is very strong on her. And additionally, another one that's really good is Prowler's Claw. This gives a bunch of critical strike chance, and like I said before, it's not wasted because the extra critical strike chance will turn into critical strike damage, and with the Ambusher trait having so much, it actually works out to be a huge amount of damage. This works really well on Camille. It also works really well on Smeech. Smeech, when he's jumping around and resetting, just having him run around more and targeting random units helps him to do an insane amount of damage to everything. These also give a little bit of tankiness, so it also helps with your front line having to be stable in order to be very tanky, which is very strong. But also good on Camille, because if you can make it so that Camille just randomly goes towards some backline unit and just one-shots them, you just win the game for free. So Ornn artifacts are a really good way to cap out this board very high, and a lot of times if you have Ornn artifacts, it's a good indicator that maybe you should try and angle yourself towards this comp. Additionally, like I said, because it is very flexible, if you're trying to play the tempo variation, like I said, you can play around Firelight with Echo. A lot of times, this version, you really want to be uncontested on Echo. It works really well if a lot of people are playing 4 costs and nobody's really playing Scrap or Echo. But the idea is that you can play 2 Echoes because you don't need that many synergies, and Echo is your frontline unit and has a bunch of durability with Scrap. You can basically play this with like 4 Scrap, or you can play it with like a similar board as before, or with multiple Firelight units. So something like, I've seen versions of this where it's like Garen, you put the Garen Watcher, the Garen Emissary bonus on the 2 Echoes, and then you just play vertical Firelight, and this is like your level 9 board. And it's actually quite strong because the Echoes do so much damage, and if you have 2 Echo 2s, it's really strong. This is like more of a meme build, of course. It's like, you know, you're hitting 6 copies of Echoes. I'm not saying this is what you normally play towards, but I'm just trying to say there are fast 9 variations that you could be aware of depending on your spot. I wouldn't recommend angling myself towards this off game start, but it's kind of like if you just happen across a bunch of Echoes, it's like, all right, I'll just go 9, I guess, and I'll play around Jinx and Echo together, and these Echoes are just going to delete everybody. So, if we're thinking about early game, a lot of times, like, the general early game opener, this is, like, the good one, where you just hit Powder, you hit Bruiser Frontline, because you get the Scrap in for the Powder, and then you have a Camille, and you get everything, and you get Ambusher, Bruiser, Enforcer, and Scrap. It works out really well because you basically want to have a melee build item. Like, you can also play, like, into ambushers from other melee units. For example, like, playing around, like, a Vi Pit Fighter, and then if you hit Camille's later, that's fine. But the idea is that you want to have some sort of melee start. You want to have melee items. When I say melee items, it's basically like frontline or omnivamp items. You know, Bloodthirsters, Edge of Night, you know, Sterex. Like, these type of items are typically good. Specifically on Camille, like I said, I really like Titans and Hodge, because I think that she just doesn't attack very fast. So just like having her like be really tanky and just stand in one spot and absorb damage is really nice. So like Hodge with the Titans works out really well. And she doesn't need as much Omnivamp as Bloodthirster. With just a Hodge, she has decent enough Omnivamp with her built-in kit. But the idea is that you play around a melee start, because like you're not going to play ambushers in to try and carry Jinx, for example. That's just too far away. Additionally, you could play it with certain AP items if you're playing around Echo and Scrap. So some Scrap openers, if you're playing around AP with Scrap, you can also play towards it. But typically, it's some sort of melee user. It doesn't have to be an ambusher. Maybe you hit ambushers later in your game and you pivot into it. But typically, it's going to look something like this. And you want to be high rolling, right? Like if you start the game off with a Camille 2, yeah, you could probably play around ambushers and do really well in that game. If you start the game out with a Smeech 2, that's even better, which happens sometimes, but like, you know, these are those spots where it's like, okay, I think I'm going to win the game right now. But anyways, so let's talk about conditions for success. So you want to have a strong early game as always, because whenever you're playing Reroll, you want to be strong early so that you can taper out and get your top 4 in case things go wrong and you can't cap out. Reroll is all about being consistent, so these strong early games is something that's going to help you out with that. You want to be relatively uncontested. I would say personally, you should be completely uncontested. The problem with ambushers that I was saying before is that you have to cap out really high around the Echo and the Jinx. Having 5 ambusher is a noticeable improvement to the board. It's like absurdly noticeable how much of a difference it makes to get to 5 ambusher. Even though the damage and chance doesn't increase, this durability on melee units is, sorry, not like the Jinx specifically, but on melee units is so powerful. It is absurd how much stronger your board becomes. So a lot of times if you're playing this board and you don't hit 5 ambusher, you're in a bad spot. So if you're trying to play around ambusher and you see people are playing Scrap, for example, like there's a bunch of Scrap players in the game. Let's say there's a bunch of Rebel players in the game. Let's say you're trying to play Reroll and somebody else decides, oh, I'm just going to play Echo and Jinx instead. So that guy's rerolling Smeech and Camille, and I'll just play around Echo and we can both play ambusher. No, that's a no-go. You can't do that. Even if you're the guy playing the Echo, you're kind of just griefing the guy that's playing the other units. Maybe if you hit an Echo 2, you can maybe play Fast 9 and Tempo and play around like the Fast 9 board. But a lot of the times, if you don't have at least 2 out of the 3 units, right? If you don't have at least 2 out of 3 of these units, you just lack a lot of the damage and damage output that you should have with the comp. A lot of times then you're just trying to play around other boards, right? If you're not going to play Vertical Ambusher, then you're going to be playing around Scrap, for example. You're going to play Echo Scrap and maybe play 3 Ambusher with 6 Scrap or something like that. These are other opportunities, but like I said, if you're trying to play around ambushers, particularly like you have an ambusher spat, you do not want to have anybody contesting these units. And if they are, you want to make sure it's as few people as possible, because like I said before, you're going to be rolling on either level 6, level 7, or you're trying to play a Fast 9 variation. But if you're not playing the Fast 9 variation, you're trying to get Smeech 3, so you don't want anybody to be holding Smeeches. You're trying to get Camille 3, so you don't want anybody to be holding Camilles. And even though you can easily hit, even if somebody's holding like a couple of them, the problem is you need to hit so fast, because you need to get Echo and Jinx in. Like, if you don't hit 5 ambusher, you're just going to fall like a rock in a pond. You're just going to be done. It's very important. So a lot of times, like, even if I see myself with some ambushers and I see like there's a Scrap player in the lobby or there's another player, I avoid the comp, because the comp absolutely falls apart if you don't hit the 5 ambusher. Of course, maybe you don't get punished as hard in your games. Maybe something is a different experience for you. That's fine. But for me personally, I wouldn't recommend playing this comp unless you're completely uncontested. And what I mean by that is, like, not only are you uncontested on the reroll, you're also uncontested on the higher level versions of it. And that applies for all variations, just because you need to high roll along the way in order to actually reach your max cap. So, like I said before, I'll make a little joke for you guys watching, but hitting 5 ambushers is critical. Okay, sorry, I'm so stupid. Okay, reroll, like what I was saying before, when you're rerolling, you really want 2 carries, right? You're either going to be carrying 2, it's always 2 out of the 3 of them, right? It's either Smeech and Camille, or it's Smeech and Echo, or it's Camille and Echo. Depending on where you hit, which ones you hit, or which ones you have more of, you can adapt to figure out which one you want to play. And then you want a tempo. You really need a lot of tempo if you're trying to play this variation, right? You have to be really far ahead. Like, this is like a win streak, 100, Mr. 100 streaking that you're trying to play around, like this Echo level 9, right? And even if you hit this level Echo 9, you don't have to play like double Echo. You can just play like legendary units like Rumble. But this is more like you're strengthening your board by using Echo to carry yourself to a point where then you could use 5 costs to fully win the game, right? Basically, all of these other units do nothing, right? All of these other all these other ambusher units do nothing, and you're just relying on Echo to tempo you to level 9, and then once you're level 9, your carries become, like, your extra damage basically comes from the 5 cost units that you're upgrading. So, that's the video. That's a little guide. Hopefully this helps. Remember, like I said, for me at least, I would try and be completely uncontested when playing this line. It is very strong. It's quite easy to cap very high. It feels very high roll at times, so be careful. Don't get baited too much by it, thinking that it's like absurdly strong. It is very strong. It's just like you need to hit like your 3 stars, and you need to be able to hit 5 ambusher. I recommend rolling on 7 a lot of the time, but like I said before, if you have way more Camilles than everybody else, you can roll on level 6, complete the Camille, then use the rest of your gold to push levels, make it to 8, make it to 9, hit your 5 ambusher, and win out. If you like my content, make sure to like and subscribe. And yeah, tomorrow I'm going to do some more guys on stuff like built diff and some of the hero augments. I'm not sure if it's going to be one video or if it's going to be split up into multiple, but I just want to do ambusher guide first because I think this is one of the more popular and consistent, like, reliable comps that people are playing nowadays. So thank you for watching. Have a great day and see ya. Bye bye.